Greetings, classicists, and welcome to Book 16, Odysseus and the much-awaited reunification with Telemachus, his son. So, as always, it's the Book 16 test, so have a go, do it yourself under time conditions in 4 minutes, and you need to be getting, she's gone off to do it, you need to be getting 70%, preferably 80%, to ensure that you are on track with the knowledge that you need. If you're not getting those scores, then you need to start working out how you're going to retain that information. I would suggest using the reading questions, so the sort of 40-50 questions that you get for homework, and turning those into Quizlets or Kahoots, or even good old-fashioned paper flashcards, whatever it is that you need to take on board that information, because you're expected to have this level of knowledge when it comes to the exam in 2 years' time. There will be no book for you to refer to, there'll be no cheat sheet, you won't be able to look at your notes through your file when you think that I'm not watching all the other things that you pull in class that I'm well aware of, but don't pull you up on. So yeah, you need that level of knowledge. So stop the video and crack on with that and self-mark. Good. Okay, so let's get started. Why are sons so important to Homeric heroes? Well, the idea is that you draw a little spider diagram. That's why there's a spider there. So stop the video and have a go. See if we can get 3, 4, 5 ideas. Good. Okay, so why are they so important? Well, I guess you could have put the word Kleos in a big circle around the spider, because it is all about Kleos, the continuation of lineage and immortality, because a hero stays alive forever, in a sense, if they pass their Kleos and their deeds down to their son, and their son adds to the name and passes that down, and you have this, unbroken sort of sense of lineage of great deeds from hero down to hero down to hero. So a son is a crucial vessel for keeping that alive. Sons can also be useful in a sort of slightly more immediate and practical sense, in that it is perfectly possible that you can be on the battlefield with your son. They can give you physical aid and physical support. They can give you sort of aid and support by being on a slightly different battlefield, contributing to your Kleos as a family. So think about Achilles and Neoptolemus, two great warriors. Although interestingly, the sons do seem to be inferior to fathers. Odysseus' son Telemachus is by far inferior. Achilles' son Neoptolemus is a great warrior, but probably a bit too much of a psychopath. Doesn't quite have the perfect warrior nature of Achilles. One might argue that's not to say Achilles isn't a psychopath, but he redeems himself where perhaps Neoptolemus doesn't. Agamemnon's son Orestes, that's an interesting one, because in some ways Orestes is morally superior to his father, but at the same time it's not as though he leads a great army to Troy. He kills his mother and manages to find redemption. He never becomes anything more than that. So anyway, sons are absolutely crucial to a Homeric hero for Kleos lineage and the continuation of the family name, for immortality. There's also a degree of status to them. It is considered a good thing to have sons. It shows that you're favoured by the gods, much like Siamese cats. That's also a sign of favour by the gods, isn't it, Meme? Yes, absolutely. Okay, so moving on, we start book 16 and we see quite an interesting scene with Odysseus and Eumaeus and Telemachus. So a couple of questions to consider. How does Homer describe the reunification of Telemachus and Eumaeus, and how might the Eumaeus-Telemachus relationship be responsible for the nature of Telemachus? Have a think, jot down some ideas, and it's important that you do this. You need to get used to analysing these things for yourself, because when it comes to revision, when it comes to other texts and works, you may not have video support, so get in the habit of doing it. Don't just sit there eating Kit Kats until I tell you the answer. Also, given how smart most of you are, rather all of you, you'll have your own great ideas and answers that are as valid, if not more, than mine or Mei's. So do it. So Homer describes the reunification of Telemachus and Eumaeus in a slightly strange way. Remember, Telemachus is coming back from his odyssey, visiting Sparta and Pylos and amassing some Xenia gifts and learning where Odysseus is gone and getting himself out in the world politically. So this is Telemachus returning from that journey. And interestingly, the reunion of Telemachus and Eumaeus is described as in the same way as a father greeting a long-lost son, which is quite a strange thing for someone of Eumaeus' status to be described as. Remember, Eumaeus is a sort of slave/servant. I think it's a tricky one because we tend to think of slaves as people in chains doing hard physical labour, but that's not actually the nature of a great deal of slavery. So Eumaeus, is he a servant? Is he a slave? I mean, it depends on your definition. But I think it's okay, it's safe to call him a slave, and he indeed calls himself a slave. So, feel free to do that. So why has Telemachus got this relationship like that with a slave? This sort of embracing and sort of father-son bond. Now, how might this relationship be responsible for the nature of Telemachus? Well, it's interesting. Eumaeus shows amazing Xenia. He shows brilliant Xenia to Odysseus on numerous occasions. Even though Odysseus is a beggar, he gets given the finest food. He gets to sleep by the fire. He gets given a seat. Questions asked at the right time. In book 14, when Odysseus tells a story about being cold in Troy, Eumaeus understands that this is a sort of coded request for a cloak because he's cold and he doesn't want to be rude, so he nips off and gets him a very nice cloak. So Eumaeus' Xenia is absolutely impeccable, and we see the same thing with Telemachus. One might argue Telemachus' Xenia is absolutely impeccable as well, as we'll see coming up. So it seems to be that Telemachus' characteristics echo those of Eumaeus rather than Odysseus. You think about Odysseus, he's got great skill with words, he's got great cunning and great physical bravery, and Telemachus doesn't seem to have picked up those attributes yet because he hasn't been around Odysseus. But he has picked up great Xenia because he's been around Eumaeus. So Eumaeus in a sense is his real father. Is that why Telemachus isn't brave? Is that why actually he's a bit whiny and a bit cowardly when it comes to dealing with the suitors in comparison to, say, Orestes? Because he's been brought up by a slave who has great Xenia but fundamentally lacks physical bravery. Something to think about. Did that work? Yes. So how does Telemachus show excellent Xenia to Odysseus, who believes to be a humble beggar? And how does this contrast to the Xenia of the suitors? So this is a slightly strange scene in a sense, because this is the first meeting of Telemachus and Odysseus, and Mei as well, apparently. Not really the kind of gushing reunion that everyone was hoping for, but we'll come on to their real reunion, if you like, in a bit. So anyway, jot down some ideas. How does Telemachus show excellent Xenia to Odysseus, who believes to be a humble beggar, and how does this contrast to the suitors? So stop, have a go, and maybe have they stopped? Yes, good, excellent, well done. So moving on. Well, first of all, he tells the tramp not to get up. And remember what's going on here. You've got one of the great lords of Ithaca, in a sense, the owner of Odysseus' estates. Not quite the new king, because the title seems to be a bit of a strange one. But, Telemachus is in theory a powerful noble. And he's telling a tramp not to get up from the seat that, in theory, Telemachus himself owns. And there isn't a spare one. It's not like there are a few lying around. Eumaeus has to go off and create a sort of seat out of brushwood and and a fleece. So there's a real gesture of great Xenia. They share the same food, and this is good, generous portions of food. So it's not as though he's given a nice loaf of bread and told to sit outside with a glass of water, which would be perfectly appropriate for a beggar. He's given the full treatment, the equal treatment. Is he given too equal a treatment, perhaps? Is Telemachus' Xenia a little bit, I don't know about inappropriate, but does Telemachus perhaps view these low status characters with too much respect? Sorry, I have to jump on the computer. No, thank you, Mimi. Maybe. And is that because he's been brought up by Eumaeus, been brought up by a slave? He's got some idea of, he sort of knows about status and hierarchy, but it's not implanted in him in the same way as it would be as if he'd been brought up by Odysseus. Now, Telemachus also shows great respect to Eumaeus because he asks the Xenia questions, if you like, of Eumaeus rather than Odysseus himself, at least to start with. And this is acknowledging that actually in this situation, Eumaeus is the host. Yes, Telemachus owns the whole estate, owns Eumaeus, but in the hut, in the house, he's kind of acknowledging a little bit of, not lordship, but, he's acknowledging the host status of Eumaeus in this situation, I think, by addressing Eumaeus with questions about Odysseus rather than Odysseus himself. Then as the conversation develops, Telemachus is horrified at exposing Odysseus to the poor Xenia of the suitors. So again, you've got this great lord who is offering a beggar Xenia, and he's terrified that other guests, in inverted commas, of his might abuse a beggar. So he really does care about the proper practice of Xenia. He then goes on to give Odysseus, as the beggar, who doesn't know who he is yet, a tunic, a sword and sandals, and help with his onward journey. So again, classic Xenia. And do think about it from a Bronze Age perspective. Tunics are not free. You don't go to the tunic shop and buy them. Someone in your household makes them. The same thing with sandals. So they seem relatively inconsequential gifts, but they're not. Swords are expensive. That's a big old hunk of worked metal that would have cost a lot of money. So this is unbelievably generous in terms of gifts for a beggar, such as Odysseus. Whereas most people would, of course, bring them in, sit them down in the kitchen, give them a glass of water, maybe give them a nice stick to wander off with. But Telemachus' Xenia is impeccable to this beggar who he doesn't realise is his father. Now, this is where this is a good point to sort of bring up the character of Penelope once more. Now, we've seen her in book 1, we've seen her mentioned in books 2, 3 and 4, but from this point on her character is really grown and developed, although it remains eternally mysterious. The big question with Penelope is, when does Penelope realise that Odysseus is Odysseus? Does she ever see through the beggar disguise, or is it really at the last minute in book 23 that she understands that it's Odysseus? There's all sorts of very, very interesting signs, and the beauty of it is that it depends on how you want to read Penelope. You can view her as a very cunning, manipulative individual, or an intelligent but much simpler, more naive creature. And again, it's very much up to you, the beauty of Homer. And it's interesting to note that Telemachus doesn't really understand who Penelope is. He seems quite critical of her. He doesn't understand her motivations. He says Penelope's in two minds. She doesn't know whether to stay or to leave with a suitor and go off and remarry. And I think that's Telemachus not really understanding the situation that Penelope's in, but also all the work Penelope has done to stop the suitors killing each other, stop the suitors killing Telemachus, stop the suitors destroying the house. She delay the suitors with her weaving trick. She's remained seemingly very loyal and faithful and focused on her duty to Odysseus and the family and the household. And Telemachus doesn't always seem to acknowledge that. On the other hand, we do have to think about the nature of Penelope. She is playing a dangerous game. If she cuts all the suitors off, and Odysseus is dead, then she's lost. She's finished. She's never going to remarry. She will never have a husband. She'll never fulfill her sort of fundamental role in life as a wife. She's going back to her parents, and that itself could be loaded with problems. So she does have to play quite a dangerous game. She does need confirmation that Odysseus is dead before moving on. But yeah, anyway, we'll explore Penelope a little bit later on. Now, to be slightly fair to Telemachus, he does point out that a little bit later on in Book 16 that she hates the idea of remarriage. But I don't know. I still don't think he understands her well enough and all the sacrifices that she's made. But then maybe Penelope has fooled me too, because we see Penelope flirting with suitors. Does Penelope do enough to drive the suitors out of the house? The suitors complain that she's leading them on. Should we believe them? Should we believe anyone? Anyway, let's not fall down that rabbit hole. So, moving on, Eumaeus, as part of the plan, although he doesn't know it yet, is sent off to Penelope to inform her of Telemachus's return, although she hears from other sources as well. But it's important that Odysseus and Telemachus are left alone for their reunion, although Telemachus doesn't realise it yet. So then we get a very moving, or potentially quite moving and important scene in the Odyssey, which is the final, or rather the realisation that Odysseus and Telemachus are father and son. So before the meeting, Athene appears and does what she does. She makes Odysseus, better looking and taller and more handsome, and perhaps more appropriate of status. So perhaps more as he would be if he'd come back from Troy with a glorious army and into an appropriate welcome. So, giving him that chance for that kind of real entrance, if you like, that was taken away from him, or that we thought was taken away from him in Book 13. So how important is that? Telemachus sees Odysseus as this godlike figure. In some ways, quite important. Maybe that's why Telemachus sort of follows Odysseus, believes it's Odysseus eventually, follows Odysseus's plan. If he was still a croaky old beggar, would Telemachus ever be convinced? Maybe yes, maybe not. Again, one of those debates for you. So we have this scene where Odysseus appears as a god, or appears in godlike form, and Telemachus's initial reaction is quite sad in a sense. He's terrified. He's convinced that it's a god come to trick mortals and fundamentally bring suffering. So once again, we see a moment that should have been a sort of beautiful emotional moment, kind of corrupted and made sad. And we've seen that on the beach in Ithaca, where Odysseus he's back on Ithaca, but it's misty, and so he's terrified, and Athene tells him where he is, but he can't trust Athene. And the kind of purity and excitement of the homecoming is marred somewhat by, I guess, by the circumstances, by the fact that the suitors are so dangerous. And maybe again, that's one more thing we can blame the suitors for. One more sign of their corruption, the damage they've wrought on society and Odysseus and Telemachus. So a moving scene, especially as they do when they work it out. They do sort of break down and hug and cry until the sun comes up. But it takes them a little while to get there. Now, does that make it more moving, or does that make it tinged with sadness, or a bit of both? It's very much up to you. Now, what I would like you to do is a 10-mark question on this reunion of Odysseus and Telemachus. So just a few things to remember with regard these 10-mark questions. You need to be making about 7 or 8 points. So a little quote, 3 to 4 words, maybe 1 word. I don't want to give hard and fast rules because It's up to you. It depends on the passage, blah, blah, blah. But anything more than about 3 or 4 words, you're probably just writing too much. Turn it into your own words and just pepper it with a few quotes. So, no introduction or conclusion, just go straight into it. For other essays, introductions and conclusions are important, they're part of the mark scheme, but for these short 10-mark questions, they're not. It's just get the stuff down on paper. If you put it into 3 different paragraphs or 2 different paragraphs, it does make it more digestible, but there are no marks for structure, so in theory, the examiner can't penalise you for it. So point, explanation of how it answers the question. Again, crucial skill for all essays. Read the question. What are the key words? What's it actually asking? In the past, the questions have been pretty much identical. How vividly does Homer depict blah, blah, blah? But that's not always what the questions will be. Sometimes there will be 2 focuses or foci to them. Sometimes they will be not necessarily a clean and simple analysis of literary techniques. You did one on Odysseus's speaking skills, which is not quite the same as Homer's literary techniques, although it kind of is in a way. So they are not always going to be how vividly does Homer depict blah, blah, blah. Although that will be the general sense of most questions. So another thing that you need to be careful of doing is waffling. So you know, if you're only managing to get out 10 lines, and 3 of those lines are something like, in this passage, Homer creates a vivid meeting of Odysseus and Telemachus, full stop. You know, you're getting at the question with that, but that's a bit waffly, a bit of a waste. You want to go straight in with, you know, Homer vividly depicts the meeting of Odysseus and Telemachus through the use of this word, which means this, and it's further reinforced by this word, which further develops our understanding of, you know, blah, 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 all focused, all precise, all answering the question. So give yourself a maximum of 15 minutes. Really, in the exam, you'd have 12, but I'll give you 15. Now, it's really important that you stick to these timings, because a lot of you could go away, spend 45 minutes doing it and do it perfectly. That's not the skill. That's not what's going to happen in a year and a half's time. Well, living in a cave because of plague in a year and a half's time. But let's assume the exams are going ahead. You've got to get used to functioning under time pressure. It's difficult, but it's what you're going to be tested on at the end, and it's so important that you do it. Anyway, so 15 minutes, no more. Write the 10 marker, and then have a look on the back at the, well, not answers, but suggested ways of answering the question. Good. Off you go. Right, welcome back. Hope you stopped and had a cup of tea and a Kit Kat as well. So let's move on with book 16. So the next thing that happens is that Odysseus and Telemachus decide that they need a plan. And Odysseus has obviously been thinking about this for a while. Now what I'd like to do is have a look at lines 266 to 307 and have a look at the plan. What are the key elements of the plan? Break it down into a little list. Also, give some thought to the quality of the plan. Is it a good plan? Is it a bad plan? To what extent, for example, does the plan rely too heavily on others? Does he use enough other people? Are he and Telemachus really going to fix the problem? And to what extent in the plan does Odysseus show cunning and intelligence? Answer all of these questions. So what I would do is I would put one element of the plan, then underneath that, does it rely too much on others? And then answer the question, does it show cunning? Or rather, how does it show cunning? So again, stop it. I'll give you 10 minutes, however long you need. Break the plan down, do that. Good, well done. So the plan, is it a good plan? Well, first of all, Telemachus needs to go in first without Odysseus. And I think this is important because I think it's all about avoiding suspicion. The suitors have been given hints that Odysseus may be alive, maybe coming back. You know, is it impossible that they work out that Telemachus and this beggar are connected? Or maybe they don't even maybe they don't think it's Odysseus. Maybe they think it's a friend of Telemachus or an ally of Telemachus, or they might attack the beggar as a way of attacking Telemachus. So to at least initially approach separately from Telemachus is a good idea. And as always, whilst Odysseus may be great at avoiding suspicion, Telemachus is inexperienced, and he may be the one who blows it. So next, and going back to that sort of idea of maybe Telemachus not being completely in control, we've got Odysseus telling him to ignore insults, because Odysseus knows that the suitors are going to abuse him. And it's a pretty terrible thing, to have the king of Ithaca being abused in his own palace by suitors who are eating his own food, and they will abuse him by throwing his own furniture at him whilst they try and kill his own son and sleep with and marry his wife. So these are phenomenal insults for a Homeric hero to have to deal with, and Odysseus has spent a long time working out how to deal with them, but can Telemachus. Odysseus is saying, don't just ignore them, don't rise to the bait, as one would be expected to do. And Odysseus even goes so far as to say in the next point, talk soothingly to them. But then he does say warn them, and this is important for our concept and our understanding of justice. As I said before, the suitors do get a whole series of warnings. Sometimes they're clear and direct. Penelope says, you're being abusive, leave. Sometimes they're signs from the gods. Sometimes they're clear and direct expressions from Odysseus as a beggar. So and then the prophecy of Theoclymenus. So there's all sorts of things that are suggesting the suitors are doing wrong and that they need to leave. And one could argue that when they're brutally killed at the end, it is just or justified because they've been told that they're breaking the law, they've been warned of the consequences, and they do nothing. So maybe there's an element of sort of justice in there as well. Odysseus is saying to Telemachus, warn them. It's only fair and just that you warn them. Now, Odysseus then says to Telemachus, I'll give you a nod. Now, that's important because Telemachus and Odysseus, it's probably best if they don't talk, particularly. Again, you want to avoid suspicion. Also, a nod is a pretty clear gesture in a sort of crowded, noisy room. If Odysseus shouted or screamed or did something else that drew attention to himself, it may be misheard, miscommunicated, all sorts of things could go wrong. But a nod is quite a good, clean, simple gesture. And the idea of hiding the weapons because they'll get smoke damage and they need to be polished is again, a cunning idea. It's not threatening the suitors. It's just making the place, better for the suitors to have their parties. So it's a really good way of avoiding any kind of suspicion. If Telemachus started surreptitiously taking them off the walls or hiding them away, they might get suspicious. And it doesn't seem as though Telemachus is smart enough to kind of think of these excuses on the fly. The next part of the plan is obviously that enough shields and spears are left behind for Odysseus and Telemachus to fight the suitors. So a great idea in a sense, but maybe there's a weakness here. Will two individuals be able to overcome, 100 or however many suitors there are? The numbers ever so slightly change, but it's about 100. Has Odysseus thought this part of the plan through, I wonder? Stabbing 100 people to death is very exhausting and tiring work. And even if they're not armed, surely they could overwhelm two individuals, especially given one of them is not an experienced warrior. So maybe there's a weakness there. And we'll see how that weakness is overcome in a couple of books' time. Next, and seemingly quite importantly, it's tell no one else. Don't trust the women or the servants. Now, we don't know whether Penelope can be trusted. We've got the example of Clytemnestra to suggest that they, and to a degree Helen, to suggest that they can't. And it turns out that they probably could have trusted Penelope, but maybe she would have revealed it unwittingly or unknowingly. Now, actually, in the future, we see that it was very sensible not to trust the servants because there are both male and female servants who betray Odysseus clearly and explicitly. So if they'd been told or warned, even indirectly, things could have fallen apart really quite significantly. So it seems to be a good cunning plan that requires thought and intelligence and violence, as do so many of Odysseus's plans and solutions to problems. So after the plan, oh, hello Loki. Loki's come to give his words of classical wisdom. So after the plan, then we change focus to Ithaca. So we have this contrast between Eumaeus' hut, where there's perfect Xenia, good planning, nobility, legitimacy, against the palace of Odysseus, where there's corruption, excessive wealth, poor Xenia, and chaos, if you like. So these sort of two kind of contrasting locations and ideals and individuals. But anyway, back in the palace, we have an interesting scene with the suitors. Now, it's very easy to think of the suitors as one group, and in fact they're often described as one group, but they're not. They are a collection of individuals, and the degree to which they are guilty does actually vary. One could certainly argue, not that Odysseus makes that distinction in the end. Now, Antinous and Eurymachus are clearly, they're bad. They are evil. They're wrong. Antinous is a proper villain, as is Eurymachus. But Amphimenus is a more complex character. So, although he doesn't stop the attempted murder of Telemachus first time round, when they try and murder him again, they realise he survived their ambush, and they say, we need to go and kill him. Amphimenus stops them then and says, no, we shouldn't do this. We need to make sacrifice to the gods and see what Zeus fundamentally tells us to do. And that does go back to an important moral principle. If the gods tell you that it's okay to do something, it's okay to do it. If they tell you it's not okay to do it, it's not okay to do it. There isn't really a morality beyond the whims of the gods once you've consulted them. So if the gods say it's okay to kill Telemachus, it's okay to kill Telemachus. It doesn't matter about Xenia or anything else. So Amphimenus is, preventing the murder of Telemachus and trying to consult the gods, shows perhaps someone who is trying to do the right thing. And it's also important to remember that being a suitor of Penelope isn't in itself a crime. Odysseus himself was, a suitor for Penelope. Most of the heroes were suitors for Helen. They stayed for a long time at Helen's house, trying to win her hand, and it all got very complicated until Odysseus sorted it out. So, being a suitor, wanting to marry a beautiful woman, isn't in itself a crime, and staying at the house for a period of time isn't necessarily in itself a crime. Now, obviously, the suitors do cross over into this idea of moral crime with attempting to kill Telemachus and staying there perhaps too long. But it's not necessarily a clear-cut thing. And one of the essays that's often asked is, to what extent should the suitors have been killed, or was it just to kill all of the suitors? And it's there's some complexity to it. And I think Amphimenus is a good example of that. He is, in many ways, actually a respectable figure. And maybe that's why we have a quite interesting little snippet of him and Penelope, because Homer tells us that Penelope finds his company pleasing. So we get this sort of sense of maybe they've had the odd little fireside chat together, a little bit of a flirt. Penelope, after all, has to be careful about the suitors. She may have to choose one. She can't irritate them all or piss them off, because maybe they'll start killing people like her and or Telemachus, or it is a complicated situation. And we get hints that Penelope is walking a very, very complicated line between showing any kind of impropriety and actually being able to deal with the suitors. And you can go beyond that. You can look at Penelope as a bit more mischievous and a little bit more nefarious, if you like. I don't think she would have gone as far as cheating on Odysseus, although you can't believe anyone in the Odyssey. Or you can look at her as a much more innocent woman who doesn't really understand what's going on. Very much up to you. Anyway, we then see Antinous, and he is shown to be really, really quite evil in the way he speaks and what he demands. So we can argue that Antinous shows himself to be truly evil by attempting to murder Telemachus a couple of times. I mean, I have some sympathy for him, but anyway, no, mustn't say that. So the idea of murdering your host is an appalling one, as Penelope herself says when she launches into a tirade against him. But Penelope's tirade or angry speech reveals a really important detail about Antinous. Now, it turns out that Antinous' family and Odysseus' family are proper sort of guest friends. They've had this guest friendship relationship, and Antinous' father was accused of piracy and was being hunted down by a mob who were keen to kill him, and he took refuge in Odysseus' house, and he was given safety and sanctuary. And so Antinous and Odysseus' family have this kind of formal relationship, and if anything, Antinous' family owe Odysseus a kind of debt of honor, a debt of gratitude. So for Antinous to show up and try and kill Telemachus after this is in the family, or with the family of who saved the life of his father, this shows you just how kind of morally corrupt and backward and nasty and vicious Antinous is. Now, Eurymachus is a very different sort of suit, or a very different sort of problem. Eurymachus, a good way of thinking of him, is a kind of an inferior but sort of evil Odysseus. So he's very similar. He's good at speaking. He uses tricks and lying tales in an attempt to deceive people to get what he wants. So Eurymachus says, when Penelope makes her scene in Book 16 and says they're all evil and demands that they leave and they shouldn't kill Telemachus, and it's an abuse of Xenia and the gods and all those sorts of things, Eurymachus says, well, nothing is further from my mind than killing Telemachus. What an appalling idea. So he's lying. He is trying to calm Penelope down, trying to win Penelope's sympathy, trying to bring her on side in a sort of similar way to Odysseus might. It doesn't work, and maybe that's the difference between Eurymachus and Odysseus. Odysseus's skill and speech and understanding of the way people's minds work is far superior. We also get a further detail on Eurymachus that points to his sort of moral corruption, if you like. Eurymachus reminds Penelope that Odysseus used to have Eurymachus on his knee and feed him little bits of meat when Eurymachus was, a very young child. So, Eurymachus has clearly visited Odysseus's household and been taken in and looked after and well fed, and Eurymachus is using this story to try and soothe and calm Penelope, even though he wants to kill Telemachus. But again, that points to the kind of moral corruption, the bankruptcy of Eurymachus, as well as Antinous. So this is how we know that these two are particularly evil. There's no suggestion that Amphinomus has done something similar, one might argue. But on the other hand, he must have known he was pushing the bounds of Xenia. He knew about the attempted murder of Telemachus. Whether he agreed with it or went along with it or whatever is perhaps a bit murky. So it's one of the great debates of the Odyssey. So moving on. Right, what I would like you to do now is have a look at a Masslit video. I'll put the link up on the homework assignment, and it is Barbara Graziosi, and she has done an interesting video on the plot and structure of the Odyssey. Because now that we've got quite a bit of the way through, we're starting to see shapes and patterns, and we've seen books 1 to 4 as the Telemachid. We've then seen books 5 to 8 as Odysseus on Phaeacia, and then we've seen 9 to 12 as the Wanderings and a giant speech for Odysseus. So it's, and we've landed in Ithaca. So we've got a good idea of the structure of the book and some of the things that Homer uses. So as always, listen to Graziosi and jot down academic arguments or ideas. Try and get at least 10. And remember, what you're trying to find is arguments that can be applied to the whole of the book, so you can use them in a whole variety of different essays. But again, sometimes there will be very specific ones, about books 1 to 4 or books 9 to 12, so don't ignore those either. So 10 academic arguments. What I would also like you to do with this is explain why you agree or disagree with them, because it's important that you have your own opinion. When it comes to writing longer form essays, you need to interact with these academic opinions. You need to express them in your own words, but you need to say whether you agree with them or not and why. So make sure you're doing that. So quite a long list, quite a long activity, 15, 20 minutes, half an hour. Anyway, that is the end of book 16. So well done. I will see you later on.